hidden gem of wartime literature. Welcome, Mere Mortalites, to another round of the Mere Mortal book reviews. I'm your host, Kyron, of the Mere Mortals podcast and the Value for Value, but this is the Mere Mortals book reviews where I go deeper into the books that I'm reading, give you the juicy information that is within, extract some themes you might not have thought about, give you an overview of these books, just try and get you motivated to read some books like I have been recently after a massive book last week in Book Wars, which kind of just ruined me. So I have gotten onto something a little bit lighter today, something a little bit easier. I typically focus on books that are usually at least 10 years old, classics if you want to call them that, because I find some more knowledge in them. And so today we have The Moon is Down by John Steinbeck. I'm absolutely sure that is how it's meant to be pronounced. Like a Gru did, because I'm pretty sure Minions was published before 1940, right? No, of course it wasn't. But this book was published in 1942. It's 115 pages in length, if you want to even call it that. Even shorter, it's got the afterword here, so 115, 130, about 100 pages, and it's like a pretty small book, right? It's not even the size of my hand, barely that. So I would say it took me 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours of reading to get through in total. You can really fly through this one. So what was my initial motivation for reading this? Why did I get into it? Well, I just needed a big break from, I needed a break and a big break from the last couple of books, Manufacturing Consent, Book Wars. I think there was even a couple before that, which were like, they just took it out of me. Reading a 500-page book is, at this current stage, where I'm only reading maybe like half an hour to an hour each evening, those really took it out of me because I needed to start reading during the day, and even then I had a break. So needed something light and easy, and light and easy for me is John Steinbeck. I really, really love him as an author. So it's, I suppose, just one. I actually hadn't heard of this one, The Moon is Down. I've read most of his classic ones, and I've still got a couple of his bigger ones, like I think East is Eden or something like that, to still read. But this one just kind of popped up and I'm like, all right, sweet, I'll grab it. In terms of like initial impression, it gets into it really quick. It's a short story, so I think he's designed this in a certain way, very differently compared to his normal style of writing. So it gets a quick introduction to the major characters, the setting. I think he's done well to change up his style because, as I said, he normally has a more of a lingering style, and he's compressed it into this shorter format that we have here today. So let's jump on, I suppose, to the plot, the style. It's a relatively simple plot. We have a small village in an unnamed country, and it's invaded, and we kind of just get right into the invasion portion of it. When I say a small village, I don't know. He doesn't state explicitly. It's very kind of vague on the details. You can kind of infer that it's probably like a Scandinavian, Norway, Denmark sort of country, and they've been invaded by a force which is similar to kind of like the Nazis. This was written in 1942, and I'll explain more of the historical context and why that's important later. But that's kind of the feeling you get from the book. A small town, maybe a couple of thousand people, if that. It seems rather unexpected, completely out of the blue. The townsfolk were not expecting this. And the invaders are not tyrants. So they take over the town, and it's like, hey, we've taken over this town because they needed the coal mine. And so then they just, start kind of bossing the townsfolk around. But they're not like putting them in chains and whipping them or anything like that. It's just like, hey, they're trying to establish relations with the mayor. You see they're just regular soldiers, but with a job to perform themselves. They don't necessarily want to do this, but nor do they see themselves as the bad guys either. So their perceptions of life were somewhat shaken because they initially thought like, oh, we'll take over this town and then, everything's going to be good. The townsfolk will love us, that sort of thing. Their perceptions over time are like, oh, okay, no, there's actually a bit of animosity growing here. And we see that animosity grow, and that kind of is the basis and the context of what happens in this book as the resistance grows. So it's rather descriptive in nature, in terms of style-wise, mixed with dialogue of the characters. Overall, the focus is on the plot as the characters don't have too much development. There's just not enough time to be able to really get into, okay, what's the inner workings of this character when you've only got 100 short pages to kind of play with. So we have Colonel Lancer, the kind of reluctant enforcer. He's the top dog of the invading force. Mayor Orden is the insightful bumbler. He's kind of like the mayor of the town, but he's kind of like, you kind of could take him for being a bit of a fool at times, but he's also knows kind of what's going on. He's sort of like the representation of the town, of the people. We have his somewhat sidekick, Dr. Winter, who is the wise man who helps dictate, or is like the sounding board, I guess, for the what's actually going on in Mayor Orden's mind, i.e. the townsfolk. And then we have, the simple-minded but stocky townsfolk, and then these kind of like increasingly desperate soldiers. So I'm going to give you an example of the dialogue, or rather I should say Cole is going to, and I see him in the chat as well, so that's really cool. So let's jump onto page 47 and hear what this sounds like.
Mayor Orden bowed and Lancer went on. I like you, sir, and I respect you, but I have a job to do. You surely recognize that. Orden did not answer. He looked straight into Lancer's eyes. We do not act alone or on our own judgment. Between sentences, Lancer waited for an answer, but he received none. There are rules laid down for us, rules made in the capital. This man has killed an officer. At last, Orden answered. Why didn't you shoot him then? That was the time to do it. Lancer shook his head. If I agreed with you, it would make no difference. You know as well as I that punishment is largely for the purpose of deterring the potential criminal. Thus, since punishment is for others than the punished, it must be publicized. It must even be dramatized. He thrust a finger in back of his belt and flipped his little dagger. Orden turned away and looked out of the window at the dark sky. It will snow tonight, he said. Mayor Orden, you know our orders are inexorable. You must get the coal. If your people are not orderly, we will have to restore that order by force. His voice grew stern.
What I really love about this is the atmosphere that he kind of creates in the book, and it changes very rapidly. If you saw in the picture at the start, you kind of had like this almost dreamy village type. I imagine it like a Christmas-like atmosphere right at the start. The snow falling. It's almost like there'd be this continual tinkle of bells or something like that. This is my impression of what a Christmas is like, a white Christmas. I've never actually experienced one myself, and so what I really like is how this changes throughout the book, and we can see this in this example here. Colonel Lancer, he's like, I respect you. He's talking about how he actually likes Mayor Orden, but then he's like, by the way, we need that coal, boy. We need that coal for Christmas. And so this changes throughout the book, and we can see this atmosphere sliding as well. The light falling snow is initially like this, dreamy wonderland, and then it kind of turns into like, that light falling snow is probably dampening them kind of uncomfortably, and the Christmas tinkling of bells is really nice until it's like a constant jingle in your ear that's grating on your nerves. So we see this atmosphere slide at the start of the book of being rather pleasant, literally imagine in your mind's eye the kind of like picturesque, dreamy little town, and then how it slides into this kind of, I wouldn't say a dystopian nightmare, not even close to that, but it certainly slides into like, this is actually becoming in a bad situation, a bad place. Bad things are starting to happen to people. People are getting killed, both on the soldier side and on the civilian side, and we see the atmosphere change over time. So this gets us, I suppose, onto the questions and themes. And I think this will be a rather short, the book itself is rather short. The first is to remember that people are always people over the long run. And so even though we see these situations where the invaders come in and, they kill 6 of the townsfolk, for example, or 6 of the soldiers in the town, and that they overtake things and they kind of seem harsh and a little bit cruel at start. But then we get to see their characters and we're like, they're not that bad people. They're soldiers. And so we see this with that they can be humanized, and they're all individuals. We see this with Captain Loft, who's a teetotaler, everything by the regulations, rules kind of guy, and he's, they talk about, he's going to be a general one day because he follows like the army procedure to the letter. He's probably like the most unsympathetic of the bunch, of where you'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, he's the closest there is to a baddie in this. We see Lieutenant Tonda, who's just a lieutenant who becomes increasingly desperate for some physical connection with a lady, but then, she's like, are you gonna like take me by force, by, rape me, violate me? And he's like, no, I don't want that. I want a connection with you, because he has this imagination of like settling in the town, owning some property, having a wife. But the townsfolk are very hostile to him, and he hates this feeling that's happening to him. Captain Bentek, he's just a kind guy. You look at him and you see he's like really apologetic about having to shake people down. He steps in front of a comrade to stop a fight and ends up getting killed. And it's like, oh, okay, like, this is actually a good guy. You kind of like feel sorry for him that he gets taken off so quickly. And so all of them, we can see that, war is cruel. There's no doubt about it, and unjust. But it's usually a short period, and it's like a heightened state. You get worked up into these things. Whereas if you're trying to live with someone as they are in this town and kind of be overseers, enforcers, a different dynamic emerges. And you might say, okay, Karen, but what about prisons? What about slavery? How these people were living with them, but that was wrong, that was bad, that they were cruel and things like that. And I think there's a passage here that highlights an important point on page 59, which we'll get into, talking about how there's different types of lording over people. So Cole, take it away.
And they knew when they cracked or relaxed or slept too long, it would be the same here, and their sleep was restless and their days were nervous. They asked questions their officers could not answer because they did not know. They were not told either. They did not believe the reports from home either. Thus it came about that the conquerors grew afraid of the conquered, and their nerves wore thin, and they shot at shadows in the night. The cold, sullen silence was with them always. Then 3 soldiers went insane in a week and cried all night and all day until they were sent away home. And others might have gone insane if they had not heard that mercy deaths awaited the insane at home. And a mercy death is a terrible thing to think of. Fear crept in on the men in their billets, and it made them sad. And it crept into the patrols, and it made them cruel. The year turned, and the nights grew long. It was dark at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and not light again until 9 in the morning.
Yeah, so what we see from here is the conquerors can somewhat become the conquered. And this is what happens in the book. They take over this town, but the townsfolk and their resistance, whilst not an active, let's like try and kill and murder these people who've taken over us, because that wouldn't work. They do have this kind of hostile atmosphere that comes about where it ends up, hurting the conquerors, the invaders, more than it hurts the townsfolk. And this is due to just like straight up numbers of people. If you're outnumbered 1 to 10, or probably even more, 1 to 20 by people in the town, even though you might have weaponry and things like that, it's kind of like, oh, okay, you got to watch your back, because they can have knives, they can, punch me, they can kick me, all these sorts of things. And we see this, the small I don't think can ever really win over the long term over a force, especially if they're forcing them to do things they don't want to. They're forcing them to get the coal from the mine, if they're forcing them to behave in certain ways and, not read certain things and not believe certain things and not do certain practices, like go to church at this time or whatever. And, there's a curfew and all of these sorts of things. It's, coercion and violence leave a lingering trail that I think takes decades to overcome, if ever. And there's certainly grudges and in certain countries where, people can't live with another group of people because they hate them so much. I think institutions, once again, getting back to like slavery and jails and things like that, I imagine back in the let's just take the Roman times, the Greek times, when they had, proper slaves, the slaves would be treated as part of the household. And if you had like a good relationship with your slave, whilst they might not, have the luxuries of you as like the privileged, wealthy landowner, I imagine that a better household would be one where the slaves are happy themselves, and where if they left and were freed, their life might not be better outside than it is inside the wealthy household if they've got a kind master who's treating them. And the kind master gets, in fact, like a person who wants to be there, so they don't have to watch their back if Spartacus comes in and a slave revolt happens. So we kind of see, okay, even though there can be dispositions of power, it's probably better if you're kind and nice and not using violence or coercion or, the minimal amount necessary to someone who is kind of underneath you. And that is probably a better way to live in general. And I think we see this with jails as well. The Scandinavian, Norwegian jails, they're almost like homesteads. They look like, nice places to get away. Sure, the people might not want to be there in total, but they're treated kindly. They're treated like humans. And I think they end up having way better, results in terms of, recidivism of like breaking the law again once your sentence is passed and you're kind of rehabilitated instead of shunted away, much like the American system is, which is pretty ugly and gross. So that's the main themes that I get from this book is, be kind to people and don't invade countries. That's probably not a good thing. Let's jump on to the author and some extra details. So John Steinbeck is an American author. I've talked to him about him a lot before. I've done a lot of book reviews for him. So I would say just go check out some of those if you want to do that. I might even do a ranking episode of all the books of his for a filler episode next time I need to do that. And because I think that would kind of be a fun thing to do because I've read, like 5 or 6 of his books now. And I do intend to read more. So instead, let's jump onto like the context of this book. And I think it's actually rather important. And the afterword in this is pretty interesting. So I think there was maybe 10 pages of this afterword, maybe a little bit more. Yeah, 10 pages, about that, 15. And what was really interesting about this book was it was written expressly to provide resistance. So if you'd seen the title, it was of this, it was Propaganda I Can Get Behind. And this book was actually written as propaganda. John Steinbeck, during the wartime, wanted to help out, and he wanted to help, write something that would provide resistance for countries or for people who'd been taken over. And you could think you could write a book where it's like about these cruel Nazis who had overtaken the country and like they were evil, bad people. And it was like, let's write a book about this amazing resistance that rises up and fights against them and the good guys win at the end. But it's like, if you try and do that, you get killed and everyone around you gets killed. And so instead he wrote a book which was dictated based on people who is actually meeting from these kind of countries, refugees who managed to escape from, somewhere like Paris or somewhere like Finland or particularly Norwegian countries where, or not Norwegian, Scandinavian countries where he had access to some people who had their town taken over by the Germans and, or like the Nazi force or like the force. It could still be their own townsfolk of a different political party who'd taken over and installed a dictatorship, whatever. And so he wrote this for kind of providing hope for those sorts of people living in these types of places. And he got a bit of flack from other writers, journalists, critics for saying like, this book is so unrealistic. It's actually propaganda for the Nazis because you're putting them in a good light. And once again, he doesn't use the word Nazis, nor does he give a specific country in the book, even though that's the kind of context behind it. And and it's like, this book will never be great. It's terrible kind of propaganda. And in fact, it actually was really, really good. It got translated a whole bunch of times, put out in like all of these, distributed via printing presses of an individual dude hand rolling it underneath the Gestapo headquarters and, distributing it out in France and in Denmark and in Norway and in Finland and all of these different countries and Switzerland. And it might have been altered in some places. I'm sure it was on a lot of lists as like books to be banned and burned and things like this. But there was certainly, reading the context behind it, it's like, oh, this was actually a highly, highly influential book. What's interesting is propaganda as a word gets a pretty bad rep, and I think rightly so, because in most cases it's the, mass propaganda that we saw in the Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman book. But in this case, I think it's a somewhat of an exception, mostly because in my mind, what he's promoting is relatively good in terms of like if you're in this situation, what's the best thing to promote? Is it to promote violence against the aggressors themselves? Is it to like promote coercion and violence in that sense? And instead it's more like a non-violent resistance. And what happens in the book is they end up getting this dynamite, and they parachuted to them by like some allies overseas, and so they use this to like blow up the train tracks and just cause nuisances and problems, rather than a full-on like, let's try and kill these people who have taken over our town. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And the book itself, it has elements of style. It's not just a propaganda piece which you read and it's like, oh, okay, well, I can see the obvious bias behind this. And so we'll go on to this last quote here just to give a sense of like what the book's actually like and why it's not just a propaganda piece.
Beside the fireplace, old Dr. Winter sat, bearded and simple and benign, historian and physician to the town. He watched in amazement while his thumbs rolled over and over on his lap. Dr. Winter was a man so simple that only a profound man would know him as profound. He looked up at Joseph, the mayor's servingman, to see whether Joseph had observed the rolling wonders of his thumbs. 11 o'clock? Dr. Winter asked, and Joseph answered abstractly. Yes, sir. The note said 11. You read the note? No, sir. His Excellency read the note to me, and Joseph went about testing each of the gilded chairs to see whether it had moved since he had last placed it. Joseph habitually scowled at furniture, expecting it to be impertinent, mischievous, or dusty. In a world where Mayor Orden was the leader of men, Joseph was the leader of furniture, silver, and dishes. Joseph was elderly and lean and serious, and his life was so complicated that only a profound man would know him to be simple.
I love that. I love that classic Steinbeck wordplay where it's, I know only like a worldly man would know him to be simple, and then the vice versa for the Dr. Winter. And that was on page 2/3. So we get really into it really quickly, where it's like, okay, there's actually some clever writing here, which I really appreciate. And I think the book on its own does have a bit of merit as a story in itself. I read the whole thing through and thought, this is a decent book. And then I read the afterword and I was like, oh, wow, the whole context behind this now makes it much more fascinating. Sure, it was written with an express purpose, and propaganda is what Steinbeck himself called it. But I think it has enough literary merit to go and substance as a story to go, you know what, it's worth reading for this. It's not something that you can just brush off as like, oh, that's, it's total like Joseph Goebbels just like random ranting or whatever. It's like, no, this is well constructed and it has some merit behind that. Much like I would say something like Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. There are portions of it where you go like, oh God, this is a bit much, especially when they do like long speeches at the end in Atlas Shrugged from John Galt, for example. But man, there's some other portions as well where it's like, damn, that was a really interesting book. Atlas Shrugged, I think as a book, as a plotline, as a story, is really quite interesting, and I quite enjoyed it. And then it just has some portions at the end where it's like, ugh, okay, there's a bit much. I didn't get that from this one. There was no like explicit, and that's probably just due to the length of it. But nevertheless, it's pretty interesting. So let's jump on to my final summary, similar book recommendations, things like that. It's an easy, short read. The story itself was evocative, but not particularly intense. I'm not going to say it's like really going to sear into my mind because it's just a bit too far from everyday reality for me. 1, I don't live in a small town. 2, I'm not in Europe. 3, the winter, all those sorts of things. The setting was far out, and then also just the situation, being overtaken by an invader. I've never really got to experience that myself. So it was interesting, but like it wasn't a deep connection to me. It's quite cool for its historical context. I did enjoy that, so I'm very glad I read it for that reason. Much like last week with Book Wars, on a personal rating, I would give it much higher because I find it interesting with the context added behind it. Book Wars last week, I was reading this stuff for personal interest, but in terms of like someone just getting this book and reading it, I'd probably give it like a 5.5 out of 10. It's not gonna like blow your mind in terms of literary style, in terms of themes, in terms of all that stuff. It's just a nice, short, simple read. So overall, I'm giving John Steinbeck's The Moon is Down a 5.5 out of 10. Worth checking out, and it's pretty short, so you'll get through it quickly. What's some similar books, recommendations? Well, obviously, read any of his other works. Of Mice and Men is probably the closest in terms of the length and being written by him and the kind of intensity of the book, or the seriousness of it, I would say. Sweet Thursday is also a decent shot because the character in that doc kind of reminds me of Dr. Winter in this book, or some of the characters. So those couple of recommendations. Here's a curveball for you as well. Try out Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography if you want to know more about nonviolent resistance, because that's really what's in this book here. So there we go, a couple of different things. I'm going to jump onto my Boostagram Lounge here, and I'll in fact maybe talk about why this is going to change up in the future. First of all, I did see Juan in the chat. I did see Cole McCormick. I did see Johnny. He said, Steinbeck is awesome. I finally made it out to Salinas last November to see his house in the museum. Very interesting. I hope you like East of Eden. It's my favorite book. That is coming up soon. I'm reading another of his at the moment, which is The Winter of Our Discontent, but I will get on to East of Eden shortly. I promise you that. So it's coming. It's coming, Johnny. The Boostagram Lounge is where I like to thank people who have helped to support the show, especially in a monetary form. Unfortunately, once again, we do not have any Boostagrams coming in this week, and we also don't have any live people streaming in or anything like that. Look, this is where I probably need to kind of almost accept defeat in some ways. I think I've tried to make this the best podcast I can in terms of like the audio side of things, and for whatever reason, it's just not gaining traction. And look, I've been putting a lot of effort onto YouTube as well, and I talk about the comments, I talk about the live things and things going on like that. So I think in the future, I'm probably going to turn this into more of like asking for a PayPal donation, or maybe I would even be willing to set up a Patreon just as like a try. I don't particularly like that service, but I have had people say to me that they would use Patreon for a channel like this. So it's one of those ones where it's like I just would appreciate like the feedback and things like that. And I'd love to know why you don't particularly tune in or whatnot. I'm kind of growing to accept that this channel is more always going to be a passion thing, and it's if I want to kind of get serious about finding a way to fund a lifestyle based on creating content, I'm not sure it's going to be through this avenue of book reviews, because I'm not going to read the recent books. I just don't want to do that. I don't find them interesting. I don't find them valuable. And that's kind of where most of the attention goes, and most people are like really diving into those things. Nor am I going to get on authors and make this like an interview type style. If I'm going to do that, I'm going to do that on the Mere Mortals podcast. So just a couple of little things here where I'm just thinking, I might just make this more of an experimental channel and as a purely fun sort of thing. And so if life gets busy, this will probably be the one that falls by the wayside, because I'm just not seeing support in terms of not only like kind of feedback's actually okay. And I'll jump onto some comments shortly. And, Johnny in the chat says, Winter of Our Discontent is great. I hope you like it. I'm actually really enjoying it at the moment. Really enjoying it. So, there's a couple of things here where I'm just going like, okay, I think I might need to change up what I'm doing with the podcast and as a total, as a whole. And especially with not expecting monetary support from this, because I guess it's just not valuable enough for the people at home. So that's okay. I'm not going to try and enforce my will upon people who do not want it. I'm not going to try and coerce you to support the podcast in that form, and we can just make do with comments and things like that. So I did get a big long message from Daniel Coates about mass media in manufacturing consent. I might have already talked about that. I'm not going to read it out totally. Pedro just said, nice video, dude, for the book wars, and he recommended to me Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo, which actually was in my list. It's way down the bottom. I'd kind of forgotten about it. It'll kind of be hard for me to get here, I think, especially if I wanted to get it in the original Spanish, but I'll give it a shot, man. I'll give it a shot. And then we had, oh geez, how do you say this name? Rogilo, my Brogilo 5171. Fantastic review. Normally I'm not very into books, but this was very insightful. And then a little love heart emoji. Thank you, man. Thank you. I really do appreciate that. That's really cool. I hope it inspires you to read. And that's kind of what I do these book reviews for. It's also a little bit for myself to get out some of the thoughts in my head of what's going on in these books. So yeah, I really do appreciate that. I'll give it one last shot. You know, there's a little sad puppy on your screen at the moment, and that's because I'm not getting any financial support back from people for doing this, which will get me onto my last little section here, which is that this is a value for value podcast. Like I do all of this because I do want to create a connection with people. I do want to hear more about their experiences reading books. I want to inspire some people to try and read some books, or to help a person who is doing I know there's kids who listen to some of these and do it for like literary essays and things like that. So that's really cool. I do hope it helps out with all those sorts of things. And yeah, I'm just looking for some interaction back and forth with people. So please, reach out via the YouTube and leave a comment or connect with us on any of the social media platforms. All the links are down below. Sharing, creating a clip that you think is interesting from this, or whether it be on the video side of things or on the audio, is very much appreciated in either case. And honestly, it's kind of like essential for me to keep going and continuing, because it is very lonely speaking to a void at times. So that's why it's so awesome when people like Johnny and Cole and Juan pop up in the chat and are here to experience this live experience with me. So I do go live 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on a Thursday, which is Wednesday UTC 0 midnight. So wherever you are in the world, your time zone, the plus or minus it from Wednesday midnight, and you'll know when I am live and maybe be able to join me. So yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thank you everyone for joining in. Next week, I do have, as I already mentioned, The Winter of Our Discontent by John Steinbeck. That'll be the review for then. I do hope you're enjoying. I will be traveling to Brazil in a couple of months, so the book reviews will probably be changing up anyway. So all will be as usual for the next 2 months, I think, and then after that we'll kind of see what's going on. I know Juan also has a couple of book reviews to do, which he might save up until that April period where I'll be flying and in transit and all sorts of things. So we'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much for joining in. I do hope you have a fantastic day reading wherever you are in the world. Karen out.